Imagine waking up in a world where your life is not your own. Imagine being dragged before a king whose decisions are absolute, whose word is law, whose mercy is nothing more than a distant concept whispered about in myths. Imagine knowing that your fate has already been sealed, not because of what you did, not because of your crimes, but simply because of who defeated your people. If you want more forgotten stories like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel before we go deeper. Across the ancient world, from the burning deserts of Mesopotamia to the marble halls of Rome, from the mountain fortresses of Persia to the blood-soaked plains of the Mongol Empire, female prisoners were not simply captured. They were transformed into symbols, transformed into tools, transformed into offerings, punishments, and messages written in human suffering. Their agony was not an accident of war. It was not collateral damage. It was a design, a carefully crafted political weapon, a mirror of the darkness that lives inside the hearts of powerful men when they're given absolute authority over the lives of others. And some of these punishments, some of these fates were so cruel, so calculated, and so deeply terrifying that even ancient writers, men who had witnessed the worst of human nature, struggled to describe them. They wrote in coded language. They used euphemisms. They turned away from the full horror of what they had seen. Today, we will uncover what ancient rulers truly did to their female prisoners. We will walk through the palaces where these decisions were made. We will stand in the throne rooms where fates were sealed with a single gesture. We will explore why these punishments were considered fates worse than death itself. And we will ask ourselves what this reveals about the nature of power, the architecture of cruelty, and the millions of voices that history chose to forget. This is not a story with easy answers. This is not a story with heroes waiting to save the day. This is a story about what humans can become when no one is there to stop them. To understand the cruelty of these punishments, you must first understand the world that created them. You must step back in time to an age that exists now only in ruins and fragments, in broken pottery and faded inscriptions, in palace walls that still bear the weight of ancient screams. This was an age without human rights, an age before the Geneva Convention, before international law, before the very concept that all humans possess inherent dignity. An age where kings held the power of gods, where emperors claimed divine mandate, where rulers spoke and entire cities burned. This was an age where war was not the exception, but the constant background noise of civilization. Armies marched across continents. Empires rose and fell within a single generation. Cities that stood for 1,000 years were reduced to ashes in a single afternoon. And in the wake of every conquest, in the aftermath of every siege, came the prisoners. In Mesopotamia, where civilization itself was born between two rivers, in Egypt, where pharaohs built monuments to eternity, in Greece, where philosophers debated the nature of justice while slaves worked the fields, in Persia, where an empire stretched from the Mediterranean to India, in Rome, where roads connected an entire world under one banner, and across the vast steppes of Asia, where horse lords built empires on speed and terror. Women captured in war occupied the lowest position in any social hierarchy. They were not citizens. They were not even considered fully human in many legal systems. They were reminders of defeated nations. They were tools for psychological warfare. They were bargaining chips in political games they could never understand. They were property cataloged and distributed like grain or gold or livestock. History remembers the philosophers. History remembers the generals, the architects, the poets, the lawmakers. We know their names. We read their words. We study their strategies. But hidden underneath those grand stories, buried beneath the foundation stones of every great civilization, is another truth. A truth lived by millions of women whose names were never written down, whose voices were never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged as anything worthy of remembrance. They were the invisible infrastructure of the empire. They were the silent witnesses to history's greatest triumphs and darkest failures. And for thousands of years, their stories remained exactly where their captors wanted them. In silence, in darkness, in oblivion. Until now, you cannot understand the cruelty without meeting the rulers who designed it. You cannot grasp the full weight of these punishments without standing in the shoes of the men who ordered them. Men who sat on thrones and decided the fates of thousands with less thought than you might give to choosing what to eat for dinner. Let me introduce you to the architects of suffering. The Assyrian kings built an empire on fear. This was not an empire held together by shared culture or economic prosperity or philosophical ideals. This was an empire held together by the absolute certainty that resistance meant annihilation. The Assyrians understood something that many conquerors forgot. You do not need to destroy every city if you make an example of one city so terrible that all the others surrender without a fight. Their palace walls, excavated by archaeologists centuries later, told stories in stone. Relief carvings showed women in chains, women being paraded through streets, women kneeling before the king, while soldiers stood with weapons drawn. These are not artistic embellishments. These were documentary records. This is what we did, the walls proclaimed. This is what we will do again. Captured queens were humiliated publicly, not killed quickly, not hidden away. No, their degradation had to be visible. It had to be performed, because the message was not meant for the queen herself. The message was meant for every nation that might consider rebellion. Look at your queen now, the Assyrians said. Look at the woman who once gave you orders. Look at her now, and remember what happens when you challenge us. Then there were the Persian kings, the Achaemenid Empire, the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching across 3 continents, required new methods of control. You could not rule an empire that size through military force alone. You needed psychological tools. You needed to break spirits before you broke bodies. Kings like Xerxes, whose name means warrior king, understood that the suffering of one woman could be worth more than 1,000 soldiers. Captured daughters of rebel leaders were not simply imprisoned. They were brought to court. They were dressed in the finest silks. They were given rooms in the palace. And then, slowly, methodically, their identities were stripped away. They were forced to serve the very king who had destroyed their families. They were made to smile at feasts celebrating their father's defeats. They were turned into living monuments to Persian power. The Greek city-states, those birthplaces of democracy and philosophy, were no different when it came to the treatment of captured women. Sparta, Athens, Corinth, Thebes, they all had different governments, different laws, different gods. But in war, they all agreed on one thing. Captured women were slave property. Their fate depended entirely on the mood of the victor, on the needs of the market, on the whims of individual commanders. Athenian philosophers debated the nature of justice in the agora, while slaves, many of them captured women, served their wine. Spartan warriors, trained from childhood to be perfect soldiers, returned from campaigns with women in chains. The contradiction did not trouble them. The philosophy applied to citizens. These were not citizens. These were the defeated. Different rules applied. And then came Rome. Rome, which turned warfare into science, which built roads and aqueducts and legal systems that would last millennia. Rome also perfected the punishment parade. The triumph ceremony, one of the highest honors a Roman general could achieve, was a carefully choreographed display of dominance. Female prisoners, especially noble women, especially queens and princesses, were displayed in chains as the general rode through the streets of Rome. Hundreds of thousands of citizens lined the route. They cheered. They threw flowers. They celebrated. And the captured women walked, step by step, through a city that represented the death of everything they had known. After the parade, if they survived it, they were sent into slavery, forced labor, or fates that Roman writers described only in whispers. Finally, there were the steppe empires. The Mongols, the Huns, the Turco-Mongolic rulers who swept across Asia and Eastern Europe like storms made flesh. These are not civilizations that built temples and libraries. These were empires built on horses and terror. Women captured during raids faced punishments designed not just to control them, but to send a message to every settlement within 1,000 miles. Terror was not a side effect of their conquest. Terror was the strategy. Make the next city so afraid of what will happen if they resist that they open their gates without a fight. Save your soldiers. Save your time. Rule through fear. Across the ancient world, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, the same pattern repeats like a dark echo. Powerful men with absolute authority. Female prisoners with no control over their destiny. And punishments designed not just to hurt, but to send messages, to break spirits, to reshape entire populations through calculated cruelty. Now the question becomes the one that matters most. What did ancient rulers actually do to these women? What were the specific punishments that history considered worse than death itself? And why, in cultures where death was common and life was cheap, would any fate be considered worse than simply being killed? The answer lies in understanding that death ends suffering. Death ends humiliation. Death ends the loss of identity. But what ancient rulers perfected was the art of keeping women alive while destroying everything that made their lives worth living. Let us walk through the most disturbing, most historically documented practices. Let us shine a light into corners of history that have remained dark for thousands of years. First, there was forced parading. This might sound simple compared to other punishments, but you must understand what it meant in ancient societies. A captured queen, a woman who had ruled a nation, who had given orders that armies followed, who had worn crowns and sat on thrones, was now stripped of her royal garments. She was dressed in rags, or sometimes in the torn remnants of her former finery, a deliberate mockery. Chains were placed on her wrists and ankles, heavy chains, designed to be visible from a distance. Then she was paraded through the streets of the conquering city. Not quickly, slowly. The parade could last for hours. Guards flanked her on either side. Behind her might walk her children, also in chains. Ahead of her walked heralds announcing who she was and what her nation had done to deserve this fate. The crowd was everything. Thousands of people lined the streets. They were not silent witnesses. They were encouraged to jeer, to throw rotten food, to spit, to shout insults. The queen was forced to walk with her head up, so everyone could see her face. She was not allowed to look down. She was not allowed to show emotion. Guards watched for any sign of tears or collapse. If she fell, she was dragged. If she wept, she was struck. The purpose was not physical pain. The purpose was humiliation so complete that every person who witnessed it would understand that no amount of power, no amount of nobility, no amount of royal blood could protect you if you opposed the empire. The queen's suffering became a story that spread across continents. Traders told the story in distant markets. Soldiers told the story around campfires. Mothers told the story to daughters as a warning. Then there was temple servitude. In certain cultures, particularly in the ancient Near East, captured noble women faced a fate that blended religious practice with permanent imprisonment. They were dedicated to temples. not as priestesses, which was an honor position. No, they were dedicated as perpetual servants to the gods of their conquerors. These women were taken to temples, often dedicated to the very gods their people had fought against. They were given new names, names that erased their old identities. They were given new clothing that marked them as temple property. They were taught new prayers to new gods, and they were never allowed to leave. The temple became their entire world. They woke at dawn to perform rituals. They spent their days cleaning, cooking, and serving. They slept in small cells within the temple complex. Guards watched the entrances. High walls surrounded the temple grounds. They might live for decades inside these walls without ever seeing the outside world again. The cruelty was not in the work itself. The cruelty was in watching their old lives become distant memories. It was in knowing that their families might be only miles away, but utterly unreachable. It was in being forced to praise the gods of the people who had destroyed everything they loved. It was in the slow erosion of self, year after year, until they could barely remember who they had been before the temple. Some ancient texts mention women who serve in temples for 30 or 40 years. By the time they died, they had spent more of their lives in captivity than in freedom. They had forgotten the faces of their children. They had forgotten the language of their birth. They had become living ghosts, neither free nor dead, existing in a state of permanent suspension between two worlds. Then there were the hostage harem systems perfected by Persian, Assyrian, and some Greek rulers. This was perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated form of punishment because it wrapped cruelty in the appearance of luxury. Noble women from defeated kingdoms were taken not to dungeons, but to palaces. They were given beautiful rooms. They wore silk and jewels. They ate fine food. They were attended by servants. But they were prisoners nonetheless. The palace was a cage lined with gold. Every step they took was watched. Every conversation they had was reported. Every letter they wrote was read before it was sent. They could not leave. They could not make decisions about their own lives. They could not refuse the king's demands. Their families were often still alive, ruling as puppet kings or governors under the empire's control. The women in the harem were ensured. Behave, the empire told the conquered rulers, or your daughter suffers. Rebel, and your sister dies. Pay your tribute, and your wife will be treated well. The women existed in a state of constant tension. They had comfort, but no freedom. They had luxury, but no autonomy. They were never beaten, never starved, never physically tortured. But they were never, not for one single moment, allowed to forget that they were prisoners whose lives could end with a single word from a king. Some historians have found records of women who spent 20 or 30 years in these golden cages. They watched through windows as the world changed outside. They heard news of their homelands, of rebellions crushed, of new rulers installed. They grew old in rooms filled with beautiful things they never chose. And the question that haunted them every single day was whether their sacrifice, their imprisonment, was actually protecting their families, or whether the empire would eventually kill everyone anyway. There were also ritualized punishments designed specifically to destroy dignity. These were ceremonies of degradation so carefully planned that every detail carried symbolic meaning. A captured queen might be brought before the conquering king's court. The entire court would be assembled. Nobles, generals, priests, foreign ambassadors, everyone who mattered in the empire. The queen would be made to kneel. Her clothing would be cut away, sometimes partially, sometimes completely. Her hair, which in many ancient cultures represented power and status, would be shaved. She might be marked with brands or tattoos indicating her new status as property. She might be forced to kiss the feet of the king. She might be made to repeat phrases declaring her own defeat and the superiority of her conquerors. Every part of the ceremony was designed to be remembered and repeated. The ambassadors went home and told their own rulers what they had witnessed. The nobles told their families. The servants told other servants. The story spread like ripples in water. And the message was always the same. This is what happens to those who resist us. In one particularly disturbing case recorded by Greek historians, a defeated queen was forced to serve as a silent attendant at the victor's table. She was not allowed to speak. Not one word. Not ever. She was dressed as a servant and made to stand behind the king during every meal, every feast, every diplomatic dinner. She poured his wine. She cleared his plates. She stood for hours while he conducted the business of the empire. Her silence was the punishment. Her presence was the reminder. Everyone who dined with the king saw her. Everyone knew who she had been, and everyone understood what her silence meant. The punishment was not physical. The punishment was being turned into a piece of furniture, a prop in someone else's story, a warning made flesh. This continued for years, according to the accounts. She served in silence while the king entertained guests, made deals, and celebrated victories. She watched as new conquests were planned, watched as other prisoners were brought before the king, watched as the world turned without her. And she could not speak, could not scream, could not even whisper. One word, the king had told her, and your children die. There were also forced labor camps that turned captured women into tools for building empires. Rome, Assyria, Egypt, and other civilizations used female prisoners in quarries, mills, textile workshops, and construction projects. These women woke before dawn and worked until after sunset. They pulled stones, ground grain, wove cloth, and carried bricks. The work was designed to exhaust. It was not designed to kill, at least not quickly, because dead workers were useless. No, the work was designed to extract every last bit of usefulness from a human body before it finally broke. Women worked until their hands bled, until their backs bent permanently, until their bodies simply stopped functioning. And because they were prisoners, because they had no rights, because no one was counting or keeping records, they simply disappeared when they died. No graves, no markers, no mention in any history. They were replaced by new prisoners from new conquests. The work continued. The empires grew. And the women who built those empires, stone by stone, were forgotten. Finally, some punishments were staged as public spectacles. Not for entertainment, though crowds did watch. No, these were political lessons taught with human suffering as the teaching tool. A rebellion would be crushed. The rebel leaders would be executed. But their wives, their daughters, their mothers would be preserved for a different fate. They would be brought to the center of the city. Platforms would be built. Crowds would be forced to attend. And then, in front of thousands of witnesses, the women would be subjected to punishments carefully calculated to break the spirit of anyone who might consider future rebellion. Ancient sources are often vague about the specific details of these punishments. They use phrases like subjected to the worst humiliations or punished in ways that cannot be written or treated in the manner reserved for the defeated. Modern historians reading these accounts understand that the ancient writers were describing horrors so severe that even men accustomed to violence could not bring themselves to write clearly about them. What we know is that the punishments were public, prolonged, and designed to create trauma that would pass through generations. Parents told children what they had seen. Those children told their own children. The trauma became part of the cultural memory. And that was the point. Make one generation suffer so badly that 3 generations later, people still remember and still obey. Across all these stories, across thousands of miles and hundreds of years, you see the same pattern. The punishment was never just about punishing the woman. The punishment was about sending a message to everyone else. The suffering of one became the control mechanism for thousands. What was the result of these terrifying punishments? What did ancient rulers accomplish by turning human suffering into political strategy? The answer is both simple and devastating. They accomplished exactly what they intended. Entire kingdoms submitted without a fight. When armies appeared on the horizon, carrying the banners of empires known for their cruelty to female prisoners, cities opened their gates. Kings offered tribute. The population surrendered because they had heard the stories, because they knew what would happen to their mothers, their wives, their daughters if they resisted. Rebellions faded before they could truly begin. Would-be rebel leaders looked at their families and made calculations. Is freedom worth the price my daughter will pay? Is independence worth watching my wife paraded through enemy streets? Is pride worth my mother spending the rest of her life in a temple prison? And time after time, the answer was no. The rebellion died. The empire endured. Ancient rulers understood something that modern people often forget. Pain can control individuals. Fear can control entire populations. But what truly controls civilizations is the threat of pain combined with absolute certainty that the threat will be carried out. Show mercy once, and the strategy collapses. But never show mercy, never hesitate, never fail to follow through, and you create a weapon more powerful than any army. The suffering of female prisoners became a reputational asset. Generals bragged about how they treated captured women. Kings had artists carve scenes of punishment into palace walls. Ambassadors made sure foreign courts heard detailed accounts. The cruelty was not hidden. It was advertised, and it worked. For thousands of years, this strategy worked. Empires rose and fell, but the basic playbook remained the same. Control women to control populations. Punish women to send messages. Use suffering as currency in the market of power. What does all of this reveal about the ancient world? What does it tell us about the civilizations we have been taught to admire? It reveals a truth that many people find uncomfortable. The same civilizations that built the Parthenon and the pyramids, that wrote philosophy and poetry, that created legal systems and architectural marvels, also created systematic methods for breaking human beings. These were not separate civilizations. These were the same people. Cruelty was not simply tolerated. It was institutional. It was normalized. It was engineered by the most intelligent, most educated, most accomplished rulers of their time. These were not stupid men acting on primitive impulses. These were sophisticated leaders who understood psychology, politics, and power. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they built systems to make sure the cruelty continued long after they died. They wrote laws codifying the treatment of prisoners. They trained soldiers in methods of punishment. They built physical infrastructure, prisons and labor camps and temple complexes designed to process human suffering on an industrial scale. Think about what that means. Someone sat down and designed a building specifically meant to break the spirit of captured noblewomen. Someone wrote a manual explaining the proper way to parade a defeated queen. Someone trained guards in the art of psychological torture. Someone calculated exactly how much suffering was needed to control a population. Power had two faces. One face built wonders. That is the face we see in museums, in history books, in documentaries about ancient civilizations. We see the temples and the roads. We see the art and the architecture. We see the achievements. But power had another face, one that broke people, one that turned suffering into policy, one that looked at human beings and saw only tools to be used or warnings to be made. And here's what history often glosses over. The same king who commissioned a beautiful library might also order the parade of 100 captured women. The same empire that built aqueducts to bring water to its citizens also built labor camps where prisoners worked until their bodies failed. The same culture that produced philosophy also produced systematic methods of destroying human dignity. They were not separate. They were two sides of the same coin. You cannot separate the glory of ancient civilizations from the suffering they inflicted. The temples were built by conquered peoples. The roads were maintained by slave labor. The golden age was golden for some and deadly for others. This story is not only about ancient women, though their suffering deserves to be acknowledged and remembered. This is a story about the dark potential of human power when no one is there to challenge it. This is a story about what happens when societies decide that some people are worth less than others. This is a story about the architecture of cruelty and how easily it can become embedded in the foundations of civilization itself. Every empire, every kingdom, every great civilization made the same choice. They chose to build greatness on the backs of the defeated. They chose to turn suffering into strategy. They chose to normalize cruelty in service of power. And for thousands of years, this was simply how the world worked. It was not questioned. It was not challenged. It was not even noticed by most people, because if you were on the winning side, if you were a citizen rather than a slave, if you were part of the empire rather than one of its victims, then the system worked fine for you. The suffering was invisible unless you chose to look at it. And most people chose not to look. What do we learn from this? What does the suffering of ancient female prisoners tell us about our own world, our own time, our own society? The suffering of these women is a mirror. When we look at their stories, we are not just learning about the past. We're learning about the human capacity for cruelty. We're learning about the structures that enable that cruelty. We're learning about the choices that civilizations make when they decide who deserves protection and who does not. This mirror reflects what happens when a society gives absolute power to rulers without accountability. When there are no checks, no balances, no systems to stop those in power from doing whatever they want of those without power. When might makes right and the defeated have no voice, no representation, no protection under any law. Ancient rulers had absolute power, and they used it exactly how you would expect. They prioritized their own goals over the lives of others. They treated people as objects. They designed systems of control that maximized their own power and minimized resistance. They were rational actors pursuing rational goals in a world without the moral constraints we take for granted today. This mirror also shows us what humans can become when cruelty is rewarded and compassion is seen as weakness. In the ancient world, the king who showed mercy to female prisoners was not praised for his kindness. He was seen as weak. He was seen as a threat to the empire. Because if word spread that this king was soft, that he could be moved by tears or pleas, then more people would resist. More rebellions would start. The empire would crumble. So cruelty was rewarded. The general who was most ruthless received the highest honors. The king who crushed rebellions most thoroughly was remembered as great. The civilization that projected the most fear was the most successful. And in that environment, good people, people who might have had compassion in different circumstances, learned to put aside their compassion. They learned that cruelty was expected. They learned that kindness was a luxury that power could not afford. And here's the most disturbing lesson of all. These systems did not require evil people to function. They required ordinary people who were willing to follow orders. Guards who were willing to chain prisoners. Soldiers who were willing to drag queens through streets. Officials who were willing to record women in inventories alongside grain and livestock. Artists who were willing to carve scenes of suffering into stone. Most of these people probably did not enjoy what they did. Most of them probably would have preferred kinderwork. But this was their job. This was how society functioned. This was normal. And so they did it. Day after day, year after year, they participated in systems of cruelty because that was simply what was expected of them. The mirror reflects one more thing. It reminds us that millions of voices were never recorded, yet their pain shaped empires. Every road, every temple, every monument that survives from the ancient world was built in part by conquered peoples, by prisoners, by women whose names were never written in any chronicle. When we look at the Colosseum, we see Roman engineering genius. But we should also see the thousands of prisoners who quarried the stone, who hauled it into place, who died during construction. When we read about the Persian Royal Road, we should remember the captured women who maintained it. When we admire Egyptian temples, we should acknowledge the enslaved who built them. History has a tendency to remember the victors and forget the victims. We know the names of emperors and generals. We do not know the names of the women they defeated. We read the words of philosophers and poets. We do not read the words of female prisoners because they were never allowed to write their stories. But their suffering was real. Their pain was real. Their lives were real. And they deserve to be remembered, even if we can never know their names. So I leave you with several questions. Questions that have no easy answers, but that we must ask anyway. If the most powerful civilizations in history, the ones we study and admire, the ones that produced art and philosophy and science, could treat human life this way, what does that say about the nature of civilization itself? Is civilization always built on a foundation of suffering? Is greatness always purchased with the pain of the defeated? And what about our own world? We like to believe we are different. We like to believe we have moved beyond the cruelties of the ancient world. We have laws, we have rights, we have international agreements about how to treat prisoners. But do those laws always apply? Do those rights extend to everyone? Or do we still make distinctions about who deserves protection and who does not? When our governments wage wars, what happens to the women in the conflict zones? When our economies demand cheap labor, who provides it? When our societies decide that some groups are threats, what measures are considered acceptable? The specifics have changed. We do not parade prisoners through streets in chains anymore, at least not in most places. We do not force women into temple servitude. We have different methods, different systems, different names for what we do. But the underlying question remains the same. When we have power over others, how do we use it? When we must choose between our own comfort and someone else's suffering, what do we choose? When cruelty serves our interests, do we look away and pretend not to see? These are not comfortable questions. They're not meant to be. History is not meant to comfort us. History is meant to challenge us, to force us to confront what humans are capable of, both the greatness and the horror. The women whose stories we explored today cannot speak for themselves. They are gone. Their bones have turned to dust. Their names are lost, but their pain echoes across thousands of years. And if we listen carefully, if we truly pay attention, that echo asks us to be better, to build civilizations that do not require the suffering of the defeated, to create systems of power that have accountability built in from the start, to remember that every person, no matter how powerless, no matter how defeated, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. That is the lesson. That is what the suffering of ancient female prisoners can teach us if we are willing to learn. The question is whether we will listen, whether we will remember, and whether we will choose differently than the ancient rulers who saw human beings and decided they were tools to be used in the service of power. The choice, as it always has been, is ours. If you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Humans History. Your support helps bring these lost stories back into the light. And if you want more untold history, Let me know in the comments which dark chapter we should uncover next.